Hurry, Miss Clara. Nearly there.
Hold her up! Yes, I've got her!
Push now, Dinah.
One more good one. He's here. He's here.
There you are, little one.
Because what you're about to hear is not rumor, not legend, but a fragment of American history so bizarre and so deliberately buried that even seasoned historians once dismissed it as apocryphal. In the spring of 1841, 3 male infants were recorded as being born on the same plantation in rural Georgia, all within a span of 12 hours, all bearing the surname of the master. One was the long-awaited heir to the plantation's wealth, born to the master's lawful wife. Another was delivered by the master's only daughter, a young woman whose social standing was considered unimpeachable. And the third, the most troubling of all, was born in the slave quarters, delivered by a field worker known only in the state ledgers by the single name Dinah. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And when you hit that play button, it helps the story travel further than the people in it ever could. All 3 boys would grow up believing they were bound by nothing more than geography and time. But buried deep in a collection of family letters and baptismal records lies the truth. They were brothers, not just by timing or name, but by blood. They shared the same father, and he was not the plantation owner. The first trace of the scandal surfaced not in a family memoir or a public scandal sheet, but in an obscure baptismal register from Emanuel County. Scrawled in a trembling hand, 3 entries appear under the same date. Thomas Harwood, son of Edwin and Martha Harwood. Nathaniel Harwood, son of Clara Harwood. Josiah, son of Dinah. The priest's handwriting grows uneven by the 3rd line, the ink blotted and smudged as if the act of writing itself had become fraught. Curiously, the 3rd entry carries no surname, and yet, in the margin beside it, the same surname appears again, faint and partially erased. Harwood. This would have been impossible under the rigid racial codes of the antebellum South. Children born to enslaved women were property, not kin. They did not inherit names. They did not inherit legacies. And they certainly did not inherit the bloodlines of their masters. And yet here it was, a single word that, if true, meant that the plantation's bloodline had been defied not once, but 3 times in a single night. For decades, the anomaly was dismissed by local historians as clerical error, a quirk of sloppy handwriting. But a closer look at the ledgers reveals a pattern of concealment too deliberate to be accidental. The field worker Dinah disappears from records entirely after 1841. The master's daughter, Clara, was abruptly sent north for her health that same spring, returning with an infant whose paternity was never discussed. And the plantation owner himself revised his will twice in the next 5 years, once to disinherit unnamed issue born beyond lawful sanction, and again to establish a trust for a reward raised on the property, but not of the household. It was as if the entire estate had been rearranged to accommodate an unspeakable truth without ever acknowledging it. The truth, pieced together from those fragments, is this: an enslaved man named Josiah, property of the Harwood estate, was the biological father of all 3 sons. How could that be? How could a man who was considered property father not just 1, but 3 children, one by the master's wife, one by his daughter, and one by an enslaved woman, in the same night? Was it coercion? Was it consent? Was it part of a larger, darker scheme to control bloodlines and inheritance while denying humanity? Those questions hang over the historical record like smoke, and none are answered directly. But every surviving document points to the same unsettling conclusion. Josiah's existence was an open secret, a dangerous contradiction in a society obsessed with purity and control. The scandal was too explosive to ever be spoken aloud, yet too consequential to fully erase. Even the Harwood family Bible, a document that rarely strays from the language of births, marriages, and deaths, contains an unusually defensive entry for 1841. God's was mysterious. Let what is bound remain bound, and what is broken be sealed. What was broken here? A bloodline? A hierarchy? A lie? That cryptic note is the only surviving acknowledgement of the night the Harwood estate's carefully constructed order collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. What follows is a story they tried to erase, a story written not in proclamations or confessions, but in silences, omissions, and altered records. A story of a man whose humanity was denied even as his blood reshaped the lineage of the people who claimed to own him. and a story of three sons born within hours of each other under the same roof, who would grow up on opposite sides of society built on lies. Never knowing the truth that bound them, this is where our investigation begins. The Harwood estate stood as a monument of order in a world that thrived on chaos. 50 miles inland from the Georgia coast, its white-column main house was visible from the river bend, a gleaming promise of wealth and dominion built on the labor of over 100 enslaved people. Its orchard stretched toward the horizon, its cotton fields swelled with harvest, and its main avenue, lined with pecan trees imported from France, was designed to impress visiting planners with the illusion of permanence. It was a place where everything had its place. The family in the big house, the enslaved in the quarters, the daughters destined for marriage alliances, the sons trained to inherit. And above it all, presiding like a benevolent patriarch in public and a calculating autocrat in private, was Edwin Harwood, a man whose name appeared on banknotes, church pews, and militia rosters throughout the state. Yet for all his influence, Edwin was obsessed with appearances, with the notion that the Harwood name would endure unsullied, that its line would remain pure. He built his estate around that principle. But appearances on the Harwood plantation were like the plaster on the mansion's grand columns, smooth from a distance, crumbling when examined too closely. Edwin's wife, Martha, had struggled for years to bear a son, enduring miscarriages and whispered blame. His only surviving child, Clara, was bright, sharp-tongued, and too curious for the narrow life expected of her. She often wandered beyond the veranda into the shaded walkways of the slave quarters, where the air smelled of wood smoke and stories traveled faster than the wind. There she met Josiah, a tall, quiet man in his late 20s known for his skill as a carpenter and his rare ability to read, a skill taught to him in defiance of the law by a visiting abolitionist preacher years earlier. Josiah was trusted with repairs inside the main house, which placed him in proximity to people and spaces enslaved men were seldom allowed to approach. The relationship between Clara and Josiah was the first fracture in Edwin's carefully constructed world, but not the only one. Letters discovered in the Harwood family collection decades later reveal that Edwin himself had been accused by a rival planter of inappropriate familiarity with one of his enslaved women. That woman, unnamed in the letters but identified in later inventories as Dinah, gave birth in early 1841, the same season Edwin's wife was expecting. Whether Edwin's involvement was coercive or consensual is lost time, but the timing sugs. T.S. a house where boundaries were porous, where the hierarchies of race and ownership were enforced selectively and violated in secret. To neighbors and visiting dignitaries, the Harwood estate appeared orderly, pious, and disciplined. Edwin hosted Methodist revivals on the lawn, donated pews to the church, and spoke publicly of Christian duty. But beneath that facade ran a web of silences and hypocrisies that everyone within the estate seemed to understand and no one dare name. In the South of the 1840s, such duplicity was not unusual, but rarely did it produce an outcome so astonishing, so undeniable, and so threatening to the entire social order as what happened on the night of March 3rd, 1841. Clara Harwood's story has long been reduced to euphemism, an indiscretion, a youthful mistake, a lapse in judgment. But the fragments she left behind tell a more complex tale. In a bundle of letters discovered in an attic trunk in 1937, Clara's handwriting appears in ink so faint it seems almost to apologize for existing. In one, dated August 1840, she writes to a friend in Savannah, "They tell me I must marry Mr. Whitcomb by spring. I cannot. I would sooner live in exile than surrender my soul to a man I despise. And yet, I have already surrendered it elsewhere." The letter never names Josiah, but the description, a man born to change yet freer in thought than any I know, leaves little doubt about whom she meant. Their encounters, though shrouded in secrecy, were known to more than a few. House servants whispered of nighttime visits to the carpenter's shed. A ledger notes an unusual absence from quarters on evenings when Josiah was supposed to be working. And in one shocking entry from a midwife's account book, preserved by sheer chance, the name Clara H. appears beside an appointment for a prenatal consultation in February 1841. It is followed by the cryptic notation, "Father not named, delivery expected March." What Clara did was far more than a scandal. It was a direct act of defiance against every law and custom of her society. For a white woman of her class to bear the child of an enslaved man was not only unthinkable, it was legally impossible to acknowledge. Georgia law defined the child's status by the mother's condition. A child born to a free woman was free, regardless of the father's race. But the social reality was harsher. Such children were often sent away, adopted by distant relatives, or quietly disappeared. Clara's refusal to vanish, her insistence on keeping her child and remaining on the estate, created a problem no amount of legal maneuvering could easily solve. And yet, Clara was not the only one carrying Josiah's child that spring. Dinah, the field worker, was also heavily pregnant, a fact that Edwin Harwood sought to suppress. Witnesses recalled Dinah being moved from the quarters to an isolated cabin weeks before her delivery, for her health. And in a final grotesque twist, Martha Harwood herself, after years of trying, was due to give birth within the same week. 3 women, one enslaved, one free but powerless, one mistress of the estate, all expecting sons, all within days of one another. The stage was set for a convergence no one could have anticipated, and no one would ever fully explain. It began with a storm. On the night of March 3rd, thunder rolled over the Georgia plain, and rain battered the tin roofs of the quarters. By midnight, 3 midwives were working in 3 different rooms across the Harwood estate. In the big house, Martha's cries echoed down the marble halls as Edwin paced the veranda, anxious for a male heir. In a side chamber, Clara labored in silence, attended by a trusted servant sworn to secrecy. And in a cabin on the edge of the property, Dinah gripped the edge of a straw mattress, her breath ragged, while Josiah, forbidden to be present, waited outside in the rain, his hands clenched into fists. By dawn, 3 sons had entered the world. Thomas Harwood, born to Martha, was wrapped in linen and presented to Edwin as the heir he had long desired. Nathaniel, born to Clara, was hidden from guests and declared a ward under the care of distant cousins. And Josiah, born to Dinah, was listed in the plantation ledger not as a son, but as new property, male. Yet the whispers began immediately. Neighbors noted the unusual timing. Servants spoke of resemblances, a certain tilt of the chin, the same green-flecked eyes. Even the overseer remarked, in a surviving letter to his brother, that the new boys looked more alike than cousins ought. The most damning evidence came from the estate's baptismal records. On March 12th, a priest baptized all 3 infants. Each was presented separately, yet all bore the same surname, Harwood. The first 2 were expected. The third was a scandal. When the priest objected, Edwin reportedly told him, "Blood is blood, and the Almighty knows his own." Whether he was protecting his reputation, acknowledging a truth he could not suppress, or attempting to control the narrative, no one can say. But in that moment, the line between slave and master, between property and family, blurred irreparably. The repercussions were immediate and lasting. Rumors spread across the county. Marriage proposals to Clara were quietly withdrawn. Edwin's rivals hinted at degeneracy in the Harwood bloodline. Even the local church hesitated to seat the family in their usual pew. But the most profound impact was on the household itself. Josiah was reassigned from field work to carpentry, a curious promotion for a man still legally considered property. Clara refused to leave the estate, insisting that Nathaniel be raised near his brothers. And Dinah, after her recovery, vanished from records altogether, likely sold to another plantation in an attempt to erase the most damning evidence of all. Yet the truth could not be fully contained. 3 boys grew up within sight of one another. Each told a different story about his birth, each bearing the same unmistakable features. And as they grew, the question whispered behind closed doors grew louder. Whose sons were they, really? The answer, Josiah's answer, threatened to unravel everything the Harwood name was built upon. The scandal that unfolded in the Harwood household did not appear in newspapers or court transcripts. It survived instead in the subtle distortions of the written word, erasures, omissions, and deliberate falsifications designed to conceal a truth too volatile to speak aloud. The first signs appear in the state ledgers from 1841. A birth entry initially listing Josiah, son of Dinah, is later amended to read, male property unnamed. The original inscription scratched faintly beneath the new ink. Clara's child, Nathaniel, is described in a supplemental page not as son but as ward, an intentionally vague term that shielded Edwin from scandal while severing the child from any legal claim to the family's wealth. Even the family Bible, a document treated with near religious reverence, reveals tampering. A gap appears between entries for 1840 and 1842, a missing page torn from the spine. On the verso of the preceding leaf, a half-erased line remains visible under candlelight. Nathaniel, born of Clara, and the rest is gone. The most telling evidence, however, lies in the church records. The baptismal register from March 12 lists 3 infants, as noted earlier. Yet when the same book was transcribed for diocesan archives in 1857, the third entry vanished entirely. A marginal note beside the omission reads simply, "Error corrected." What error? The priest who performed the baptism, Father Ambrose Whiteley, was transferred shortly afterward to a parish 2 counties away, under circumstances the diocese never explained. In a surviving letter to a colleague, Whiteley wrote, "I am troubled by what I was made to sanctify. Blood and property cannot mingle, yet I have witnessed it." His words were never intended for public eyes, but they survive, brittle and yellowed, in a private collection now held by the Georgia Historical Society. These acts of revision were not isolated. They were part of a larger campaign of silence orchestrated by Edwin Harwood himself. In correspondence with his attorney, Edwin speaks of correcting certain misapprehensions that might invite litigation and ensuring the stability of the succession. That stability depended on erasing any hint that Josiah was the father of all 3 boys. For if that truth were acknowledged, the implications would be seismic. Thomas, the heir, might not be recognized as legitimate. Nathaniel, Clara's son, might assert a claim to the estate, and Josiah's own child, born in bondage, would carry bloodlines that defied the legal fiction upon which slavery depended, the fiction that the enslaved and their masters were separate species of humanity. The erasure extended beyond paper. Dinah, whose very existence threatened the narrative Edwin sought to maintain, disappeared from the state rolls within weeks of the birth. Bills of sale from the Savannah auction house dated April 1841 list a woman, match her age and description. No purchaser's name appears, suggesting the transaction was private. Clara's midwife, too, vanishes from local records, possibly having been paid to relocate or silenced altogether. Even Josiah's assignment shifted. He was removed from visible work in the main house and reassigned to the sawmill on the estate's edge, away from prying eyes. These were not random personnel changes. They were the calculated dismantling of evidence. Yet, for all Edwin's efforts, the story persisted, in whispers, in knowing glances, in the uncanny resemblance between 3 boys who were supposed to be unrelated. The ink was changed, one family friend would later remark, but the faces could not be, and therein lay the fatal flaw in Edwin's campaign of erasure. The truth was not confined to parchment. It lived and breathed and grew taller each year, sharing the same crooked smile, the same arched brow, the same unmistakable mark of the man he sought to erase. The existence of those 3 boys was more than a private embarrassment. It was a direct affront to the ideological foundations of the slave-holding South. Slavery was not just an economic system. It was a worldview predicated on difference of blood, difference of worth, difference of destiny. And yet, on the Harwood estate, those differences were collapsing into one another with every passing season. Thomas, Nathaniel, and Josiah Jr., as the 3rd boy came to be called among the quarters, shared more than a surname. They shared the same broad shoulders, the same startling green-flecked eyes, the same quick wit and stubborn streak. Visitors remarked on the likeness without understanding its cause. Overseers spoke in hushed tones about the 3 brothers without daring to explain. Even the enslaved community, schooled by generations in the dangers of speaking too much, whispered of Josiah's blood running through the house. Their very existence blurred the most sacred boundary of all, the line between property and personhood. Under the law, Josiah Jr. was chattel, inheriting his mother's status, but his blood was the same as that of the heir, who would one day inherit the plantation. That contradiction gnawed at the legal and social order like termites beneath a grand staircase. How could a system claim divine sanction while denying humanity to a boy who shared the master's bloodline? How could a law that reduced him to property hold if his half-brother called him kin? These were questions no one dared speak aloud, but they hung over the state like humidity before a storm. Clara's decision to remain on the plantation compounded the tension. She refused to send Nathaniel away, insisting he be educated and raised with the privileges befitting his lineage. Edwin compromised by arranging private tutors who taught Nathaniel separately from Thomas, a division meant to preserve appearances, but one that only highlighted their connection. As for Josiah Jr., he remained in the quarters, learning carpentry at his father's side, but his presence near the main house increased with each passing year. He repaired doors Thomas would walk through. He built furniture Nathaniel would sit upon. He grew up in the literal shadow of the life that might have been his. The enslaved community understood the deeper significance of his presence. He is the master's blood in chains. One elder was recorded as saying in an oral history collected in 1893, "And chains cannot hold blood forever." That sentiment terrified men like Edwin, who understood that power rested on the illusion of separation. If that illusion cracked, if bloodlines and bondage could no longer be neatly divided, the entire edifice of slavery could begin to crumble. And so Edwin doubled down on control, issuing new rules about movement between the quarters and the house, restricting Josiah's access, forbidding mention of the boys' similarities. It was an attempt to legislate silence over what every eye could plainly see. But silence is not absence. It is resistance. And the mere existence of those boys, the heir, the ward, and the enslaved son, was itself a rebellion. They stood as living proof that no law, no ledger, no boundary could fully separate what nature had joined. The Harwood plantation had become a paradox in human form, and as the boys grew older, that paradox would prove impossible to contain. Edwin Harwood was no fool. He knew that scandal could ruin not just reputations but fortunes, and he moved with the precision of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. His first priority was legal insulation. In 1843, 2 years after birth, Edwin revised his will. The new document, drafted by a Savannah lawyer renowned for his work in inheritance disputes, contained a curious clause. No person not lawfully begotten within the bonds of matrimony shall inherit the Harwood estate. The language was broad enough to exclude Nathaniel and Josiah Jr. without naming them, while reaffirming Thomas as the sole heir. At the same time, Edwin established a trust of $2,000 for the maintenance of dependent, widely believed to be Nathaniel, though no names appear. It was a masterstroke of plausible deniability, acknowledging the existence of other children while denying them any legal standing. His second tactic was physical separation. Clara was sent to Charleston for 2 years under the pretense of convalescence, taking Nathaniel with her. There, the boy was raised under the surname Whitfield, a fiction that allowed Edwin to claim ignorance if questions arose. Josiah Jr. remained on the estate, but was hired out to a neighboring plantation by the age of 10, a common practice that also served to keep him out of sight. As for Josiah himself, he was quietly manumitted in 1845, not out of but calculation. A free man could be compelled to leave, and Edwin did just that, arranging for Josiah's relocation to a sawmill in Alabama. By removing the central figure in the scandal, Edwin hoped to erase the story's living link. Yet even these calculated moves could not fully suppress the consequences of his actions. Thomas grew into a young man haunted by whispers he did not understand. Nathaniel, despite his privileged upbringing, returned to Georgia as a teenager and sought contact with the enslaved community that bore his father's name. Josiah Jr., though denied education, absorbed knowledge wherever he could, learning to read from scraps of discarded newspapers and copying passages from the family Bible he was never meant to touch. Each, in his own way, became a living contradiction to the world Edwin sought to preserve. The final blow to Edwin's efforts came from beyond his control. In 1859, a lawsuit filed by a distant relative contested the legitimacy of Thomas's inheritance, citing persistent rumors of tainted lineage. Though the case was dismissed for lack of evidence, the court's inquiry forced Edwin to surrender portions of his private correspondence, letters that hinted at the truth he had spent 2 decades burying. One line, in his own hand, stood out It is better the world believe I sinned than to know I was not the only man whose blood runs in this house. It was the closest he ever came to admitting what he knew, that the illusion he had built his life upon was crumbling, and that no amount of law or distance could undo what was done that night in 1841. The three sons who entered the world under the same roof on that storm-racked night in 1841 would never share a cradle, a classroom, or a family supper. Yet their lives, though separated by law and design, moved in eerie parallel, orbiting the same unspoken center, a truth none of them fully understood. Thomas Harwood, the heir, grew up steeped in privilege. Tutors drilled him in Latin and law. His days structured around the expectation that he would one day oversee the plantation. He was told stories of noble ancestry and divine favor, of a lineage unbroken and untainted. And yet, as he aged, he could not ignore the unease that stirred whenever he glanced at the faces of those around him. The overseer's furtive glances, the servants' lingering stares, the uncanny familiarity in the features of a young carpenter's apprentice hammering boards outside the parlor window. Whispers followed Thomas even into adulthood. He has his father's eyes, neighbors would say, though they never specified which father they meant. Nathaniel, Clara's son, grew up in exile of a different kind. Charleston society embraced Clara, but regarded Nathaniel with polite suspicion, sensing that something in his lineage did not quite align with the genteel fiction Clara maintained. He was educated, well-mannered, and groomed for a respectable life, yet a certain restlessness gnawed at him. In private journals discovered a century later, Nathaniel wrote at 16, "I dream of a place I have never seen, but somehow know. I dream of men who look like me, but bear chains." That yearning drove him back to Georgia in 1858, ostensibly to manage a small tract of land deeded to him through a family trust. In truth, he came seeking answers. What he found instead were riddles. Faces in the quarters that mirrored his own, elders who fell silent when he asked questions, and a young man named Josiah whose resemblance to him was so striking that even strangers remarked on it. Josiah Jr., born into bondage, carried the heaviest burden of all, the knowledge that his blood was the same as those who claimed to own him. Denied schooling, he taught himself to read in secret by candlelight, tracing letters on discarded scraps of paper. He grew into a skilled craftsman, building furniture finer than any his father had made, and became known for his uncanny resemblance to the master's line. Overseers called him the Mirror Boy, a moniker meant as mockery, but that carried a deeper truth. "I saw myself in him," Nathaniel would later write. Not likeness, self. The two met only briefly in their youth, yet that single encounter, a passing moment by a fence where their hands nearly touched, would echo through their lives. The Civil War scattered their fates. Thomas fought for the Confederacy, wounded at Chickamauga, and returning home disillusioned. Nathaniel joined a Union-aligned trade delegation in Charleston, quietly funneling funds to anti-slavery efforts. Josiah Jr. seized the chaos of war to escape the plantation altogether, vanishing into the night in 1863. Records of the era list a Josiah Harwood among the freedmen who established a carpentry cooperative in Savannah after the war. Whether this was him or another man who took the name as Defiance, we cannot know. What is certain is that their lives, though diverging, continue to intersect through rumor, blood, and memory. By 1871, two of the three men, Thomas and Nathaniel, were living within 30 miles of each other, both unaware of the other's proximity. A Freedmen's Bureau record from that year mentions a carpenter named Josiah petitioning for land once part of the Harwood estate. His application was denied, but his signature, bold, deliberate, and bearing the surname once denied him, survived. It was as if the truth Edwin had spent decades erasing had resurfaced in the very ink he had sought to control. For more than a century, the story of the three sons remained confined to whispers, fragmented documents, and family lore too dangerous to speak aloud. The Harwood name endured, its descendants weaving a genteel narrative of planter respectability and paternal benevolence. But the archive, as it always does, began to speak. In the 1990s, a genealogist named Rebecca Lawrence, researching her family's antebellum roots, uncovered a cache of letters in a Charleston attic, among them Clara's anguished correspondence and Edwin's cryptic notes about correcting misapprehensions. Around the same time, an amateur historian digitizing church records noticed a faintly erased Harwood in the baptismal register of 1841. What had long been dismissed as rumor began to solidify into something more substantial, a buried truth demanding acknowledgement. The decisive evidence came not from ink or parchment, but from blood. In 2014, a group of Harwood descendants participated in a genetic ancestry study. To their astonishment, several bore significant African ancestry markers, with mitochondrial DNA linking them to descendants of a freedman community in Savannah. One participant, a direct descendant of Thomas Harwood, shared an identical Y chromosome haplotype with a man descended from a carpenter named Josiah Harwood, a freedman recorded in the 1870 census. The odds of coincidence were infinitesimal. The two men, separated by race, class, and nearly 2 centuries, shared a common ancestor, and that ancestor was almost certainly the enslaved man the records called Josiah. This revelation upended generations of family mythology. The Harwood descendants, once proud of their unbroken European lineage, were forced to confront the reality that their bloodline had never been as pure as they claimed. Some embraced the truth, collaborated with historians to piece together the fuller story. Others rejected it outright, refusing to participate in further research or denying the DNA results altogether. But the science was irrefutable. The Harwood legacy was inseparable from the man they had once tried to erase. The discovery also reignited debates about historical accountability. Should the Harwood descendants publicly acknowledge Josiah as a patriarch of their line? Should reparations be considered for the descendants of Dinah, whose child was sold away? What does it mean for Southern heritage when its very bloodlines defy the racial hierarchies they were built upon? These questions, like those that haunted Edwin in his lifetime, have no easy answers, but they reveal a deeper truth, that the past is not past. It lives on in our very bodies, in the code of ourselves, defying every attempt to rewrite it. In the end, the story of the Harwood sons is not merely a tale of scandal. It is a mirror held up to an entire society built on lies. The night of March 3, 1841, exposed the grotesque contradictions at the heart of slavery, a system that denied the humanity of black men even as it exploited their labor, their bodies, and their blood. Josiah, a man defined by law as property, fathered 3 sons who lived 3 radically different lives, heir, ward, and slave. Their existence proved what the law sought desperately to deny, that humanity cannot be partitioned, that blood ignores the boundaries men draw around it. The historical facts end, as they so often do, in silence. We do not know whether Thomas and Josiah Jr. ever met as adults, or whether Nathaniel ever learned the full truth of his birth. We do not know if Josiah lived to see freedom, or if he died before the world could acknowledge him as anything more than a name in a ledger. But the implications of what happened on that estate ripple outward still. They challenge us to reconsider how many other stories like this lie buried in forgotten pages and erased lines. How many family Bibles carry the ghost of a name once written and then torn away? How many pure lineages rest on the blood of men and women deemed unworthy of remembrance? And beyond the facts lies the deeper reckoning, the emotional and moral weight that no archive can fully capture. The Harwood story forces us to confront the hypocrisy of society that spoke of virtue while practicing violence, that preached purity while hiding the proof of its own transgressions in the bloodlines of those oppressed. It asks us, across the gulf of centuries, to reckon with the silences that remain. What would it mean to speak the names that were erased? What would it mean to restore Josiah, Dinah, Clara, and their children to the story of America, not as footnotes, but as central figures? The science of DNA has done what Edwin Harwood could not. It has bound together what was broken and unsealed what was meant to stay hidden. It has shown that the past is not dead. It is alive in the faces we see in the mirror, in the names we inherit, in the histories we choose to tell or ignore. The story of the Master's 3 sons is one such history, a story of power and defiance, silence and revelation, cruelty and love. It is a story they tried to erase, and one that, despite every effort, refused to disappear.